Hello and welcome to Camp, the Catholic audiobook in a month podcast. My name is William Wilson, and today is day 12 of The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. I will be reading Conversation-1 and the first half of Conversation-2. We finally get to hear about the tree. Now, the tree is the key to Brother Lawrence's conversion. From it, he understands God's providence, and this leads to his faith. So, very exciting. I wanted to also talk about the form we are reading, Conversations. So this is Beaufort, the compiler, who is recording notes after having conversations with Brother Lawrence. And they mostly start with that. So you'll hear that in the winter, that he had footman, that he desired, and lots of that this view. So you're going to hear the word that lots. And so I think it's after the conversation, he goes, oh, we had a conversation that this happened. So keep that in mind. It's interesting. And let's get into it. This is the first conversation and the first half of the second. Let's get started. Conversations. First conversation, August 3rd, 1666. The first time I saw Brother Lawrence was upon the 3rd of August, 1666. He told me that God had done him a singular favor in his conversion at the age of 18. That in the winter, seeing a tree stripped of its leaves, and considering that within a little time the leaves would be renewed, and after that the flowers and fruit appear, he received a high view of the providence and power of God, which has never since been effaced from his soul. That this view had set him perfectly loose from the world, and kindled in him such a love for God that he could not tell whether it had increased in above 40 years that he had lived since. That he had been footman to Mr. Beaufort, the treasurer, and that he was a great awkward fellow who broke everything. That he had desired to be received into a monastery, thinking he would there be made to smart for his awkwardness and the faults he should commit, but that God had disappointed him, he having met with nothing but satisfaction in that state. That we should establish ourselves in a sense of God's presence by continually conversing with him. That it was a shameful thing to quit his conversation to think of trifles and fooleries. That we should feel and nourish our souls with high notions of God, which would yield us great joy in being devoted to him. That we ought to quicken, to enliven our faith. That it was lamentable that we had so little, and that instead of taking faith for the rule of their conduct, men amused themselves with trivial devotions, which changed daily. That the way of faith was the spirit of the Church, and that it was sufficient to bring us to a high degree of perfection. That we ought to give ourselves up entirely to God, with regard both to things temporal and spiritual, and seek our satisfaction only in the fulfilling of his will, whether he lead us by suffering or by consolation, for all would be equal to a soul truly resigned. That there was need of fidelity in those times of dryness, or insensibility, or irksomeness in prayer, by which God tries our love to him. That then was the time for us to make good and effectual acts of resignation, whereof one alone would oftentimes very much promote our spiritual advancement. That as for the miseries and sins he heard of daily in the world, he was so far from wondering at them that, on the contrary, he was surprised that there were not more, considering the malice sinners were capable of, that for his part he prayed for them, but knowing that God could remedy the mischiefs they did when he pleased, he gave himself no farther trouble. That to arrive at such resignation as God requires, we should watch attentively over all the passions, which mingle as well in spiritual things as those of a grosser nature. That God would give light concerning those passions to those who truly desire to serve him. That if this was my design, sincerely to serve God, I might come to him, Brother Lawrence, as often as I pleased, without any fear of being troublesome, but if not, that I ought no more to visit him. Second Conversation, September 28th, 1666. That he had always been governed by love, without selfish views, and that having resolved to make the love of God the end of all his actions, he had found good reason to be well satisfied with his method. That he was pleased when he could take up a straw from the ground for the love of God, seeking him only and nothing else, not even his gifts. That he had been long troubled in mind from a sure belief that he was lost, that all men in the world could not have persuaded him to the contrary, but that he had thus reasoned with himself about it. I did not engage in a religious life but for the love of God, and I have endeavored to act only for him. Whatever becomes of me, whether I be lost or saved, I will always continue to act purely for the love of God. I shall have this good at least, that till death I shall have done all that is in me to love him. That this trouble of mine had lasted 4 years, during which time he had suffered much. That since that time he had passed his life in perfect liberty and continual joy, that he had placed his sins betwixt him and God, as it were to tell him that he did not deserve his favors, but that God still continued to bestow them in abundance. That in order to form a habit of conversing with God continually, and referring all we do to him, we must at first apply to him with some diligence, but that after a little care we should find his love inwardly excite us to it without any difficulty. That he expected, after the pleasant days God had given him, he should have his turn of pain and suffering, but that he was not uneasy about it, knowing very well that as he could do nothing of himself, God would not fail to give him the strength to bear them. That when an occasion of practicing some virtue offered, he addressed himself to God, saying, Lord, I cannot do this unless thou enablest me, and that then he received strength more than sufficient. That when he had failed in his duty, he simply confessed his fault, saying to God, I shall never do otherwise if thou leavest me to myself. 'Tis thou must hinder my falling, and mend what is amiss. That after this he gave himself no farther uneasiness about it. That we ought to act with God in the greatest simplicity, speaking to him frankly and plainly, and imploring his assistance in our affairs, just as they happen. That God never failed to grant it, as he had often experienced. That he had been lately sent into Burgundy to buy the provision of wine for the society, which was a very unwelcome task to him, because he had no turn for business, and because he was lame, and could not go about the boat, but by rolling himself over the casks. That, however, he gave himself no uneasiness about it, nor about the purchase of the wine. That he said to God it was his business he was about. And then he afterwards found it very well performed. That he had been sent into Auvergne the year before upon the same account, and that he could not tell how the matter passed, but that it proved very well. So likewise in his business in the kitchen, to which he had a naturally great aversion. Having accustomed himself to do everything there for the love of God, and with prayer upon all occasions for his grace to do his work well, he had found everything easy during the 15 years that he had been employed there. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Tomorrow I will read the second half of Conversation 2 and Conversation 3. You'll hear more on faith and more that's. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe, rate, share, and help us grow. Also, please check out oratebooks.com, now featuring The Ways of Mental Prayer by Vital Laodé. Praised by Pope St. Pius X and spiritual leaders across generations, this masterwork guides readers through the transformative journey of prayer, from its foundational practices to its most profound mystical heights. That's ORATE books.com. If you'd like to learn more about us, please visit camp.fm. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow.